probably pass some restrooms over there, but we occasionally, someone goes to use those. Well, after about 20 minutes, we figure they're lost, so we'll come find you. But this is the better one to probably go to. Okay? With that, you will note I'm using the mic, and this meeting is being taped. So if you could always, when you speak, if you could use your mic, that would be extremely helpful, and probably would be helpful if you could do as I'm doing now, talk into the mic. It's probably omnidirectional, as they call it, but it picks up better if you speak directly into it. All you have to do is push the little button down, and when the red light's on the base of it, that means it's on. Actually, there's a little light here that's red that shows it's on. With that, let me mention a couple of other things. There will be a lunch for committee members and staff. They tell me they'll be here about 12 o'clock, so we'll take a break to do that. We also want you to be reminded there's coffee, water just inside the door here. Maybe some drinks as well. Help yourself to whichever you like. Okay. Before we officially begin the meeting this morning in terms of the agenda, let me ask if anybody has a quick question about anything that you about. We will go to the agenda calls us to go to 3 o'clock today, and I'm a firm believer if you finish before then, don't delay the dismissal. So we'll certainly be out by then. It will probably help most of you in terms of traffic, so we'll be mindful of that. You will, at your seat, you should have found a folder with an agenda, and hopefully that's the case. Does everybody have an agenda? Okay. Well, why don't we do this? We have a few people that hopefully will come in, but let's go ahead and let the committee introduce it, themselves, and Ms. Comer, if you don't mind, we'll start with you and go counterclockwise and wind up. Barbara, you will end the tally for us here. Okay.
Thank you, sir. I'm Kyla Cromer, and I'm chairman of the Cherokee County School Board.
Scott Justice, principal of West Hall High School.
Good morning, everyone. Gary McGibbon with the Georgia Department of Education.
Good morning. Jeff Matthews, principal of Peachtree Ridge High School, Gwinnett County Public Schools.
Good morning. I'm Penny McRoy. I'm the Director of Educator Preparation with the Georgia Professional Standards Commission.
Good morning. I'm Bob Michael, University System of Georgia Educator Preparation and Policy Division.
Good morning. Martha Ann Todd, Governor's Office of Student Achievement.
Good morning. Will Schofield, Superintendent of the Hall County School District.
Good morning, State Representative Valencia Stovall of House District 74 in Clayton County.
I'm Alvin Wilbanks, Superintendent here in Gwinnett.
I'm Lindsay Tippins. I chair the Senate Education Committee.
And I'm Barbara Hampton. I'm the 6th District Representative for the State Board of Education.
Okay, thank you very much. Staff members, those of you that are staff members, if you would just briefly introduce yourself and who you're with. Amy, we'll start with you.
Good morning. I'm Amy Pratt. I'm the assistant to Mr. Wilbanks.
I'm Bernie Kirkland, Chief of Staff, Gwinnett County Public Schools.
Glenn Pethel, Assistant Superintendent for Leadership Development, Gwinnett County Public Schools.
Alexis Oberg, Governor's Education Policy Advisor.
Good morning. I'm Christine Murdoch with the House Budget and Research Office.
Hey, I'm Courtney Gillen with the House Budget and Research Office.
Good morning. Megan Andrews with the Senate Research Office.
We got a couple of people. We don't have that many people. Just go ahead and introduce yourself. I know one lady up there that's about to tell us who she is. We'd all be lost on legislation if it wasn't for her, so.
Hi, I'm Betsy Howerton. I work for the Office of Legislative Counsel for the state legislature. I staff the Senate and Senate and House Education Committees. Glad to be here.
I'm Scott Bierman with the Georgia School Boards Association.
Skip, did we miss you? Turn your mic on while we can hear you.
I'm Skip Yao, represent Gwinnett County and Metro Racing.
Okay, good. Okay, very good. This morning, we want to really begin with a presentation from Senator Lindsey on the purpose and charge of this committee. I think all of you know this this committee came out of House Bill 338. It was they were part of it, mainly House and part Senate. So I'm going to let Chairman Lindsey, if he would, to bring us the purpose and charge of the committee. Senator Lindsey.
My comments this morning will be similar to those that Elizabeth Taylor gave her fifth husband. I will not keep you very long. If you look at the content of the part of 338 that deals with the establishment of the Leadership Academy, is reasonably short to be legislation. It's only 50 lines long, and the charge are only 9 lines of the 50. The rest of it is the functionality guidelines of how the group is to work that considers the Leadership Academy. About this time last year, I had started making statements that I thought I wanted to have a bill to establish a Leadership Academy, and as the session unfolded, it made more sense to fold it in to 338, so it became part of that bill. It concerns me when we have had so much conversation about low-performing schools, and it just looks to me like, as a businessman, and I'll say this to start with, I've never taught school a day in my life. I'm not an education major. I've not been a principal or an official in the school. I did serve on the school board for 12 years in Cobb County. But in looking at most any organization, the success of the organization most of the time is attributable to the leadership that's embodied in that. And I think we have some good courses in leadership in our universities of the state and other states, but I personally believe that we lack the specialized leadership training to go into these lowest performing schools. And I made the statement early on that in my mind, if we wanted to establish an organization or a leadership academy, it would be somewhat like a special forces for special training when you look at the particular characteristics and the particular strategies that are needed to address the conditions that we see in these failing schools. And if you look at the criteria of these schools, there's a lot of commonality in the challenges that they face. It really doesn't make much difference which school you look at. Most of them have the same characteristics. Most of them are low socioeconomic schools. A lot of them exhibit those challenges that go along with low socioeconomics, and a lot of that's transiency, and many times you also see a very weakened family structure that goes along with that. I believe that we need to set up an academy that's different than the training that we have. I may differ from some of you, and that's fine, but I don't believe that all people can make effective leaders. I don't believe that a good teacher necessarily translate into being good leadership. Certainly they may know some of the academic aspects that it takes to be a good school leader, but the skill sets between instruction and leadership are vastly different. And I think this committee and setting up this academy needs to realize that, and we need to be able to identify those common characteristics that we find in good, proven leaders. I know that there was a movie out several years ago called The Right Stuff. I think we need to look at the common characteristics that are in those people who have had high success rates in very challenging situations. I think we need to train them for the specifics of the challenges that they find. I think we need to empower them. And when I say that, most of the time these people are going to be working under local school boards and local superintendents, but they may need flexibility in their school that the rest of their district may not need. They need the empowerment. I think we also need to have a part of this commission that monitors the success of them and can look at them as they go along, and we can learn from their successes and failures. I don't foresee this being an issue of seat time, that we see some slides and some lectures and go out and conquer the world. I think it is going to have to be much more hands-on, much more problem-solving orientation than some of our leadership courses that we've have currently. It would be my desire to utilize as adjunct professors in this process those people who have proven successes in leadership in these challenging schools, and they can come in and speak of their experiences firsthand and answer questions or field questions that pertain to the challenges that they have faced and share that. There's a lot of difference in talking to people who have read about a particular subject matter and those who have actually done it. I think, as in most successful organizations, whatever type of organization it may be, the success almost always goes back to well-trained leadership and people who understand the problems. I think in this, there are some particular characteristics as we have a matrix for looking at people who may be participants in this. Number one, I think they have to be trustworthy and able to build the trust of the communities that they'll be going into. They have to have a high degree of commitment. I know there was a book out several years ago about the grit factor. For lack of a better term, I'll say I think they have to have a lot of stick-to-itiveness. I have a nephew that was a Navy SEAL, and he was telling me one time not too long ago, he said, he was talking about going through SEALs training, and it's a very grueling process. He said he'd been in cold water for several hours, and surprisingly, the drill instructors don't come up and scream in your ear that you have to do this or you have to do that. He said to really find out how committed the SEAL candidate was, the drill instructors will say, you know, that water sure is awfully cold, and I know you're awfully tired. You've been in it a long time. You could get out and you can go take a hot shower for just as long as you want to. If you have a girlfriend or a wife, you could probably go see them. I'm sure they'd be glad to see you, and they're real proud of you, but you could get out of that cold water anytime you want to. There's good food, hot food waiting on you if you want to do it, and I know it's been 15 hours since you've had anything to eat. He said that's the toughest challenge that you face. It's not somebody screaming in your ear. It's the allure of the comfortable. And I think sometimes we have leaders that fail because of the allure of the comfortable. Those people who we identify to participate in this, if they have in their mind a concept of drop-by leadership, that's not going to work. We've missed the boat from the very inception. It needs to be an examination of the challenges that we face in these low-performing schools, and an examination and an explanation of the strategies that have been proven to be successful. I think we should seek the brightest and the best. In the years I've had on the school board, I think there's a tendency sometimes to put maybe some of our least trained people in some of the toughest positions we have. I've seen that happen. I think that's a mistake. I think we need to put our best people in the areas of the highest challenge. And I don't know of any higher challenge we have in the state of Georgia than addressing low-performing schools. It's a pleasure for me to be here to work with you on this, and I appreciate your consideration and your commitment to be here.
Thank you, Senator Tippins. And folks, you've heard the purpose and charge of the committee. We happen to be the ones that's been selected to carry it out. And let me sort of review a few things that we're going to try to follow in doing that. And if you hear anything that you want to discuss or talk about, that's what the committee is for. But first thing I think we've decided that we'll do with the committee is not reinvent the wheel. We believe there's been a decade and a half of tremendous research on what makes effective school leaders. Over the last decade, the Wallace Foundation has done some tremendous work in really identifying the characteristics or the things that effective principals do, the things that they carry out that make them effective principals. So what we want to do is we want to take a look at that research, and we're going to do that a little bit later this morning, and see what of that really pertains to us as we try to address the issues and the charge that Senator Tippins brought to us. We've also decided that we're not going to have this committee be deaf by PowerPoint. We're not going to have many PowerPoints, okay? But we are going to try to hear from a lot of people. It's by no accident that the governor and lieutenant governor and the other people responsible for appointing the committee got certain groups of people. At my right here would be our representative from the School Board Association, Cherokee County, Ms. Coleman. And then State Board of Education, Ms. Hampton. And we have members of the Senate. We have two, Senator Tippins, Senator Powell Sims, who was not feeling well today. And then from the House side, we have Ed Setzler, and we have our colleague here that has hit her name tag from me. Excuse me, Representative Stovall. I thought I would come up with that, but I didn't. No problem. And then we have representing superintendents, Will Schofield. Will's been a colleague of mine for a number of years, and we also have from the Governor's Office Student Achievement, Martha Ann Todd has been probably involved in about most anything happening in education over the last 10, 15 years at least, and before that. And then we have the university system represented, and Bob Michael, and then we have the Standards Commission. We not here today, couldn't be with us the first meeting. Glenn Cannon, Dr. Cannon will be representing the technical college system. And then we have high school principals, and then we have State Department of Education represented. So in in the minds of the folks that are responsible for putting us all on here, they thought we could do this, and so by December the 1st, we're going to be complete with our report, our recommendation to the governor. We want to turn it in then. It's not going to be an if. We want to get that in the governor's hands 1st of September, where he can really get someone, Senator Tippins, to begin legislation for it. That was the direction that he gave us. So as we go about then doing our work, we actually do want to hear from a lot of people. We want to hear from them not with PowerPoint presentations, but we are going to invite the people that are currently doing leadership development, whether it be an agency or an association, and we want to invite them to come and serve on a panel. And on that panel, they will respond to specific questions that we will give them ahead of time, such as what is your niche group? Who do you really seek to provide leadership training for? Is it principals, assistant principals, or both, or district lead, whatever? What do you feel is a strong point of the curriculum that you use? And perhaps more importantly, what do you believe has been effective and why? Those are the type of questions that we would like to hear from them on. The panels will be moderated. Probably Dr. Pethel will do several of those, and maybe some other people will be asked to do panels. But then once they respond to the specific questions, then we would open it up for the panel to ask, or the committee, to ask any questions that you would like to ask them. We think this will get sort of out on the table what's being done, and are there things that we really need to look at further. In addition, we will obviously today review a lot of the research that has been done over the past decade and a half. And you will have copies of that to review, and that's going to be our assignment for the second meeting. We also want to ask of the school districts, the superintendents throughout the state, what do you need in the Leadership Academy? What are your big needs? What would you like to see the Leadership Academy provide? And again, that won't be in terms of, we know not to have a superintendent come make a presentation, because it'll be an 89 page PowerPoint and probably an hour and a half, right? No. We have some great superintendents over the state, but we really, again, want to zero in on getting the information that we think will help us be the most effective. We also realize that what a school district in South Georgia may need, it might be different from what we have here in the metro area. So therefore, we plan to get a good cross-section of people. And Gary, I think you and I have had a couple of conversations about this, and we will be asking you if you have a recommendation of a district you'd like for us to. We have 180 districts, as you all know, so we won't be asking 180 people to be on a panel, but we will get some small districts, some medium size, and some large districts to serve on the panel. And again, we will give them a survey, and Dr. Pethel will review some of that with you when he gets up. But that's how we intend to go about getting feedback and input from the practitioners, from the stakeholders out in the state. And I'll stop and see if any of you have any comments or whatever on that. Again, we think that will be much better than it just giving people inviting them to come make presentation. Matter of fact, we don't have time for all that. We need to cut through the information that we really need. So that's sort of the strategy that we intend to use. And let me stop and see if anybody has any comments or questions.
Alvin, if I could, and the committee members, just to get some feedback, one of the most frustrating things that I've participated in over 30 years is watching groups of school-level individuals sit around and ask the question, what do you think effective classrooms look like? When in fact, I've become a firm believer that what we ought to say is the effective components of a classroom are these half a dozen things. What do I need to do to support you in making sure that those half a dozen things are going on pervasively in every classroom in your building or in your district? I'm sure this is the intent, but I would hope we would not focus on asking districts, what do you think effective leadership looks like? We know what effective leadership looks like, but if in fact we're going to have effective leadership in our schools, what can we do to support you in developing those kind of individuals and creating a pool? Because I believe over the last 30 years we've spent way too much time having dealer's choice over what effective leadership looks like in a school district. And I think we know the answer to a lot of those questions. So I guess my only comment would be, I hope we create some parameters about the kind of support the state of Georgia might want to give every district in this state, rather than opening up the question, just what does leadership look like? I think I appreciate the articles you sent out, which were a very nice synopsis. We know an awful lot about leadership and what it ought to look like. And I think the real question that I would hope people would be interested in is how do we develop more of that capacity at the local level?
Okay, good. Who else? Okay. Moving on, you did receive a couple of publications from, I think, the Wallace Foundation was out of the Wallace group came most of a number of things that we're going to give you today, but incorporated in that is a lot of research that the things that Will spoke about that we know is important in leadership and more importantly effective leadership. So as we move through then the things that we need to do to fulfill our purpose and charge. Remember, we're not here to try to change the licensing and the certification of principals. We're not here to replace university leadership programs, but we're here to really look at designing a state leadership academy that will provide us a pipeline of effective leaders. And we'll talk a little bit more at another meeting, leaders in addition to the principals. But right now the focus is going to be on the principal, okay? As we think about the academy, there are some things that I think we need to look at some things down the road of what are some benchmarks that we'll be looking at. You've already heard the biggest one is to make sure we have this report done by December the 1st, where legislation can be drafted. And then we will hope that it has a positive outcome in the legislature. And we would probably look at a kickoff of this sometimes this summer, July of 18. And it might be in a couple of phases. It might be in a generic leadership academy. But facing us today is perhaps a very urgent issue, and I think this was one of the purposes of this, and Senator Tippin spoke to this. We do have I'm not sure that I have the exact number, but like 155 schools that are low-performing schools. we want to make sure that we provide some assistance to the leaders of those schools. So that's a priority that we hope we can address or kick off with this summer. So we're already looking at a couple of different focuses of the academy in the beginning, in addition to just simply a, quote, state leadership academy. To do that, obviously, there are a number of things that we'll need to do, and that's why we're meeting here today, and that's why I think we have a committee that's about the right size to really get some things done. We do have the components of the people that make up the education community, and really can be very much a proponent of really addressing some of the needs that we all know we have. So at this time, let's turn to looking at your agenda. What we try to do is outline what we plan to do at the 5 meetings that we hope you have on your calendar. And I've outlined those beginning with meeting 1, and I'm not going to dwell on meeting 1. We'll get that later. But meeting 2 in October, that's where we will invite some of the groups that really are doing leadership preparation, and they will serve as a panel to respond to those questions that we asked them. And again, it'll be what market are you trying to reach? What have you been successful in? And how do you know that success is what you indicate it is? There may be some other things. We'll ask some folks to really look at what that communication to them is. And then the next thing we plan to do then is to have some comparison of what we hear with what the research is saying that we really need to do. What are the knowledge base, the skill set, and the talent pool of effective leaders? And the third meeting, we will again look at some model programs that we might want to consider. These will be statewide leadership programs. The states of Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware have a state leadership academy. We hope to have someone from each of those states to be again on a panel to again respond to some of the things that we might find very helpful as we consider what we would want to do in our leadership academy. Again, we will hope that they can shed some light on a couple of things like what's the operational design of their academies? How much does it cost? Which is to be part of the report that we file in December. And then we will begin looking at part of the existing programs that warrant further review that we want to look at, okay? Between the date of October 17 for meeting 3, and then on November the 1st at our 4th meeting, we will hope to have the review of our first draft of what the Leadership Academy will look like. And we will be able to allow you, we hope to get this to you ahead of time, ahead of the meeting. But if not, we'll take whatever time we need during the November 1st meeting. And then November 5th meeting, we'll begin a review of what we think will be maybe the first draft of the final draft, okay? And go from there. Let me stop and see if you have any questions. That's a very ambitious charge, but at the same time, December the 1st is around the corner, and since we don't have to go back and do all the research that we need to, we have that. Since we have a number of people providing leadership training, let's find out what of that we would like to consider, and then we look to try to put that together. And that's sort of the operational procedures that we plan to take, and the strategies that we plan to use to have this one render us a recommendation to the governor on December the 1st. Be nice if it's February, but probably December works out better. We get it done and go from there. Okay, any questions on the sort of the outline of our meetings? Yes, sir. Pardon? Do we have a Wi-Fi password? Okay. Yep. Okay. All right. So we're back to the meeting, the current meeting agenda, and we want to look at, first of all, we want to have a brief review of the documents that you have before you. And remember, this is a compilation of a lot of research that's been done over the past decade as it relates to preparing leaders, both whether they're assistant principals, whether they're principals, whether they're principal supervisors or district leaders. It pertains to all of them, but we're focusing right now on our charge on principal preparation. Introduce Dr. Glenn Pethel, who you've already met, to review this with us. Dr. Pethel. And by the way, Dr. Pethel is the person that leads our leadership development training here in the district. And Dr. Pethel has actually served on a couple of the states that we mentioned. I know you're working with Tennessee and some others. He's well versed in this field and well prepared to help us walk through some of the research that we've been a part of as well. Thank you. Dr. Pethel.
Before Dr. Pethel
Yes.
starts, can I just ask a kind of a conceptual question?
Sure.
Are we, I too am in business, I'm not an educator, so I'm sure lots of folks have information about their own ways of developing leaders, and I bring my own version of that. I wonder if it might be helpful if before you, I feel like we're talking about the content of what somebody would talk about at a leadership training, and I'm missing the logistics part of it. Do you meet on a monthly basis? Is it a course? Is it a 2-year program? That I'm missing that kind of, and maybe we're going to sprinkle that all throughout. But I feel like the things that I read were more on the content of what they would be what we would be trying to teach them at a leadership academy. And I may be missing a little bit of the logistics, but and if that's going to be filtered in, great. I'll wait.
Well, let me just answer that briefly. Certainly, we want to address the operational issues, all of the logistics that you talk about, and for example, let's just take the principles of the low performing schools. If we say we want to address that as a priority, we might have a week session with those this summer. We would then follow that up during the year with maybe a one-day session or half-a-day session. How is what you are trying to apply, what we say are the right things that effective leaders do? How is that working for you? Any question about it? So there's a lot of different methods, a lot of different scheduling components that you can do, but we'll get to some of that as well, Barbara. Good question.
Also, I kind of on the line of Barbara, are you make sure also you're covering exactly what happens, like say for instance, a person is going to college, and kind of take me from what actually happens. What are some of the courses that or things that happen? If it's a leadership course that they're taking in the 4-year, kind of as far as making sure that we're kind of touching on that. Because I'm not an educator either, so I wouldn't know what that whole process is. Thank you.
I have a question or a comment also. I'm just curious if this is going to be something that supplements or supplants what the local school districts are already doing, and to keep the focus somewhat on the local control of what's happening at each school district and what the school boards are providing for their leadership.
Okay. All those important comments, yep. And the answer is yes.
Chairman Wilbanks, members of the committee, it's certainly a privilege for me to be here with you today. And I've had the great fortune of working in the development of leaders for a very long period of time. And so today, in some ways, represents a dream come true for me. And that dream is that the state of Georgia would exercise their authority and the policy levers that the state has available to ensure that the quality of school leadership is what we want it to be and what we expect it to be across the state of Georgia, and that the quality of that leadership is not necessarily subject to population or necessarily subject to affluence or to poverty. So I see your work as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the state to have a lasting impact not only on the millions of children we serve, but the generations of children that the work of this committee has the possibility of impacting. So again, it's my privilege to be with you, and I look forward to sharing information with you. Mr. Wilbanks and I share something in common, and that is an avoidance of PowerPoint presentations, and I think many of us probably share that as well. So I'm going to avoid any PowerPoint presentation with you. What I do want to do, though, is to start with the information that was shared with you electronically. So we shared two documents with you. And Ms. Hampton, again, as you said, I'll begin to perhaps sprinkle in some of the answers, as well as with you, Representative Stovall, as well as with you, Ms. Cromer. So you'll begin to see some sprinkling in of some of that along the way. So in addition to the two electronic documents we sent you, you also have a file folder. And within that file folder, not only do you find the two documents sent to you electronically, but you'll find some other documents. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about all of these documents and what these documents represent. So the two documents that we sent you electronically, one was the response from Education Commission of the States. And many states, including Georgia, rely upon ECS, particularly with research-type questions. And what you see is an earlier inquiry from Mary Hunter Hipp, who was the policy advisor at that time. And you see very clearly what her question was to ECS as a research group, as a group that is very much aware of what's going on across the state. And her question was, we're interested, what are some of the resources on school leadership? And ECS responded and said, well, you know, there's some information about what principals should know and be able to do. And we find that information, one of our primary sources, is in a 2004 document or publication. That publication was created and supported by the Wallace Foundation, a New York City leadership focused foundation, a foundation that has assets in excess of $150 billion, an organization that typically focuses on school leadership. In fact, I would offer that there is more focus from the Wallace Foundation than any other organization that I'm aware of in the United States. But a study that they quote here is one that is frequently quoted by those of us in leadership. And it comes from a study of the research that was conducted by the universities of Toronto and Minnesota. And they asked the question, does a school principal have an impact? What kind of impact do they have? Is it a positive impact? Do they make a difference with student achievement? They don't go into the classroom, or at least many of them are unable to go into the classroom, so they don't offer direct instruction to kids. So what is it that a school principal does? What effect does having a good principal ultimately have on kids? And this landmark study, this 2004 study, for the first time comprehensively concluded that all of the research points that the impact of leadership is significant. The impact of a school leader on children, even though they do not teach them regularly or on a daily basis, is significant. And when we think about all of the impacts that we have on kids, quality of teacher, size of class, condition of facilities, support staff, support function, of all of those things, we learn from this research that the principal accounts for about 1/4, 25% of the total impact on kids. So for the first time we said, boy, if we're not paying attention to who's leading these schools, it's time for us to do that. So 25% of the impact of the school can be attributed to the quality, the effectiveness of the principal that you have. So Education Commission of the state said you really ought to look at this, because it really does say that having great principals, effective principals, makes a significant difference ultimately with children. There's some other research that's listed for you in this particular report, and I'm not going to go over any of that, but I will simply say this. Most of the other references you see in this Education Commission of the State's report are studies and reports that were funded by the Wallace Foundation. So whether it's a report from the American Institutes of Research, whether it's even the National Governors Association, whether it's the New York City Leadership Academy, all of those organizations have been funded and offered support from the Wallace Foundation over time. The second report that we gave you or provided to you was this report here. And it's a fairly lengthy report, and I'm sure some of you really wanted to dig into this. But we provided this because, again, it's a very recent report. It's a 2015 report authored by a professor of public policy at William and Mary. And my takeaway from this report emphasizes what Senator Tippins said to us earlier this morning, that states can act, states can have a positive impact. States can have an impact on how we prepare and how we support these principles. States can take action. And the biggest takeaway in this particular report for me can be found on page 11. On page 11, this report says that, yes, you do need to pay attention to the diversity in your state. That you all have urban districts and suburban districts, and all of you especially have rural districts. And so you need to pay attention that one size does not fit all. That whatever preparation, whatever support you're doing has to be unique, has to be addressing the needs locally. So Ms. Cromer, again, advice here from a person who has studied many states and learned that being able to adapt and adjust is a really important factor. Another finding in this particular report, and again, one of the big takeaways from this report, is that states should consider the establishment of a leadership academy, that states should consider everything that I've already said and many other things have said up to this point. So that's the big takeaway from this particular report. Those are the two that we provided you. In the folder, I want to talk about 3 other documents that we are sharing with you. One is a report from Missouri. And if you look at that particular document, you'll notice that it's got Council of Chief State School Officers. Like many of the organizations I've already mentioned, the Wallace Foundation supports the Council of Chief State School Officers, particularly when it comes to work focused on school leadership. What you have is the basic plan for the State Leadership Academy in the state of Missouri. Why Missouri? When we ask the question, what's going on across the United States? Are all of the 50 states? Do we see evidence of a statewide leadership academy? And the resounding answer is absolutely not. So how many of the 50 states? And the answer is very few of the 50 United States have established a leadership academy for the purpose of preparing, supporting, training school leaders. So then the question is, if there are only a very few, who are the best of the best? And one of the responses I received was Missouri is a state academy you should really look at and consider. Another was the state of Delaware. State of Delaware has had a statewide leadership academy now for a number of years, and you should look at Delaware. A state that has recently emerged as doing a great deal of work on school leadership is the state of Tennessee. And so Tennessee was offered as an example. And then the state of Kentucky. In fact, Kentucky is mentioned in the report with the blue cover. So as Mr. Wilbanks pointed out, we do want to learn from others. We do not need to reinvent the wheel, as you pointed out, Mr. Schofield. We don't need to be reminded. We don't need to do additional research. There are some tenets of what the research tells us, much like you pointed out with classroom instruction. And so the question is, if we know that and that's clear, how should we go about doing that? So Ms. Hampton, how do we go about doing that? How do we deliver that? Is it done from, a central location? Is it done regionally? What's taught? So Ms. Stovall, what's the core? Do we reteach them? Maybe what a university taught them? Or do we do something that perhaps reinforces or enhances or extends perhaps what they learned in a formal leader preparation program? So again, I wanted you to have the Missouri model. I do want to tell you that what I learned about Missouri, it's a large state, much like Georgia. But in Missouri, they have 518 school districts, quite a few more than we have in Georgia. The largest school district in the state of Missouri has 26,000 kids. So again, similarities. In Missouri, like Georgia, there are a number of areas, school districts that are more sparsely populated, school districts where the percent of free and reduced student population is much higher than others. So in many respects, what I've learned about Missouri and what you'll learn more about is that there are some similarities, some characteristics that we share. So I offer that report to you because what you have, again, is the plan. In this case, this is only the first of a phase-in for the state of Missouri. So the plan that you have in your blue folder describes what the state of Missouri will be doing for first and second year principals. Later, in fact, in the not too distant future, the state will share with us what they're doing with their veteran principals, those people who perhaps have got several years of experience. So how do we keep those principals excited, who still have that grit, Senator Tippins, that you talked about, who still want to make a difference with kids, who stay in the water because they choose to stay in the water. So we're looking forward to that phase 2 of the Missouri plan. And then there will be a third phase of the Missouri plan that we'll look forward to receiving and sharing with you at some point along the way. So that's the third of the 5 documents that you have. The fourth document that I would draw your attention to is a much smaller document, and it's the one that is labeled the Wallace Foundation. So this is the annotated bibliography of selected publications on school leadership. Unlike the Education Commission of the State's report, this is much more comprehensive. So in this report, the very first thing that you see is that 2004 landmark study of the research on the impact of school leaders. 6 years later, the Wallace Foundation again funded research from the universities of Minnesota and Toronto, and in 2010, again, released a report that since the day of its release has received quite a bit of attention across the United States. And this study and the focus was, tell me more how principals have an impact on student achievement. And one of the most quoted findings from the 2010 study was that 6 years later, the researchers in the Wallace Foundation found that yes, leadership, school leaders, principals, are second only to our classroom teachers among all of the factors that we see in our schools. And that 6 years later, the researchers in the Wallace Foundation were even more confident that if you wanted to have a significant impact on children and on their performance, one of the levers that you can pull, one of the things that you can exert power with is through the principalship. So again, I think a very important study, and most of the experts on leadership, I think, agree with me that those are probably 2 of the most important studies on leadership. But this bibliography, again, covers a number of things. If you'll turn to the second page of this bibliography, there's one particular report that I want to direct your attention to, and it's the one at the top of the second page of this report. And you see where it says effective practices of school leaders. So, Mr. Schofield, I don't need to know any more about the research. But what I do want to know, can you synthesize? Can you summarize? Can you give me the 4 or the 5? Try to get it on one hand for me, if you will. What are the things that effective principals do? This report, for the first time, describes all of that research into something that we can understand and appreciate, and they call it the 5 pivotal practices. The 5 pivotal practices of effective school leaders. And so most likely, Mr. Wilbanks will be providing this report to you in the near future, along with some more brief information about those 5 pivotal practices. And I think most of us would agree, much like the analogy to the military, the best of the best do things in a certain way. The best of the best do things more frequently than others. And that's true of school leadership. So we see highly effective school leaders who collaborate more effectively. We see highly effective school leaders who know how to communicate where we're going and how we're going to get there. So again, we'll be sharing some of that with you because, again, we believe it's a wonderful summary. It's a great way and perhaps an easier way for us to think about those things that the best of the best do in school leadership. The last document that was placed in your packet is a very brief overview of Delaware. Again, I mentioned that as one of the state models that we were directed to. And here you get, again, just a very brief and I think kind of high-level overview of what's happening in Delaware with their Academy for School Leadership. Again, this is an academy that has been in existence for some time and has a record of proven performance. In other words, this academy has evidence that because of what they do and how they provide support, how they train leaders, there is evidence that it makes an impact on kids. So again, we offered that to you and believe that there is quite a bit of good information to take from that particular document. So last but not least, you know, sometimes I like paper and sometimes I hate it, Jeff. So if you find yourself in that same predicament, we also provided these documents to you on a flash drive. And so, Will, if you go to a meeting somewhere and you know, tend to get bored, just you can pull out your flash drive and pull up your documents and have an opportunity to read there. So with that said, those are the documents that we've provided. Chairman Wilbanks, if I may, we would offer if there are any other materials or resources that you know about that perhaps we have not identified. If there's anything, for example, on the annotated bibliography, if there's anything on that Education Commission of the State's response, if anything you see that you would want more information on, then we would encourage you to let us know that. Mr. Wilbanks.
Dr. Beth, before you sit down, how about reviewing one more time the focus of the Wallace Foundation? We're putting a lot of, we mentioned that a lot, we put a lot of focus on that, but why have we sort of zeroed in on the things that they pulled together for us?
It's a good question. There are other foundations that study leadership, but there is no single organization, no single philanthropy, no other organization that I am aware of that has devoted not only the financial resources, but the time, the energy, and the network across a very broad and very diverse group of individuals and organizations. For example, it ranges from the National Association of State Boards of Education to the Council of Chief State School Officers, to the University Council on Educational Administration. So again, Wallace has as one of their primary areas of interest is learning about school leadership and sharing with others about school leadership. So the library is as extensive from Wallace as any that I'm aware of.
And they devote a sizable amount of money yearly to that. What's their average amount of grantees?
They spend, on an average, $75 million a year. And they spend that $75 million through grants that they make. We're fortunate here in Georgia that Albany State University, our Georgia Department of Education, the University System of Georgia, and others of us are engaged in what they call the University Principal Preparation Initiative. And that was a $47 million initiative. So we're supporting not only work at Albany State University, but at Pelham City Schools, Calhoun County Schools, and Daugherty County Schools. The Wallace Foundation has also supported the work on principal supervisors. Again, a growing field of inquiry. If principals make a difference and have an impact, Scott, what about those who supervise you? Is it important that we're careful about who supervises Scott Justice? And have we trained them appropriately? So they are interested in that. They are interested in other district leaders. So if the supervisors of our principals are important and can make an impact, what about other folks who work in our district offices? So Wallace is interested in that. The Wallace Foundation invested their biggest investment in the Principal Pipeline Initiative. And the Principal Pipeline Initiative, they provided grants to 6 large urban school districts across the United States, ranging from the largest school district, the New York City Department of Education, with over 1 million students, to districts the size of Prince George's County, Maryland. We're fortunate that Gwinnett County Public Schools is one of those 6 Principal Pipeline Initiative districts. We've been engaged in that work now for 5.5 years and will conclude with 7 years of experience with that work.
Now, the 6 districts that you spoke of, or the 5, I guess is it 5 or 6?
6.
6, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Us and 5 others.
Yes, sir.
Prince George would probably be the smallest.
Yes, sir.
Of those districts. We have a large number of districts in the state that have less than 3,500 students, a sizable number. Has Wallace just worked with large districts, or suburban, urban, or are they working with small districts?
Mr. Wilbanks, they are working with other districts as well.
You mentioned Pelham City, didn't you?
Yes, sir, I did. And the University Principal Preparation Initiative was one of their strategies for considering the needs of more rural, more sparsely populated areas of a state. For example, Wallace made a grant to Albany State University. Again, the Georgia Department of Education, our PSC, is involved in part of that initiative. Similar effort in Virginia with Virginia State University. So likewise, they're working with what I would consider to be moderately sized school districts to very small school districts, districts of 700 kids.
I believe the Virginia State one, working with a school district, we've heard at least the city, Charlottesville,
yes,
working
sir.
with them, and I think y'all are doing some work with them. So
yes, sir.
I guess the point I'm trying to emphasize there is this is work that spans the dimension of large districts, suburban districts, small districts, very diverse districts, very low socioeconomic districts.
The criticism sometimes has been that you're funding or giving grants or supporting those districts who perhaps already have the capacity to do this. But what about those of us who may not have? Size of district, staff, funding. What about us? Because we too believe what you believe, that having the most effective principal is really important. So maybe it's easier for you to go to the big city. Maybe it's easier for you to collaborate with 3 or 4 or 5 universities. But what about me? I'm in a rural area of the state, and the nearest university is 50 miles away. So I really want to know what you're going to do, what strategies, what approach can I take? And again, there's a lot to be learned, and Wallace is learning that, and quite frankly, Mr. Wilbanks, we're learning about that as well. Senator Tippins.
Glenn, I may have missed it if you've already covered this, but the programs that you have looked at in the states that have undertaken this, have they, the mission of their training programs, is that a broad-based mission, or is that specialized for low-performing schools?
Yeah, it's both, Senator Tippins. I think, again, we're not alone that we have low-performing schools. Other states do too, and they're very concerned about that. But what we will see in the next few meetings is that the academies are addressing leaders in general, in a general sense, from how do we move people who are just thinking about leadership into entry level, to those who are in the early stages of their career, to those who are in the midpoint in their career, to those who, again, are tackling chronically low-performing schools in the situations. What the treatment there, is it different? Is it the same? So we're going to see, I think, in most cases, a blend.
Right. I think probably look from a legislative expectation standpoint, since this was in 338, which had to do with turnaround schools and specifically low-performing schools, I would prefer to see more of the case study work on those that have trained specifically for the greatest academic challenges in those schools.
Yes, sir, and an interesting phenomenon, I think. We've been talking about low performing, we've been talking about chronically low performing schools, and how we're doing that, and we've read about, heard about, and or participated in a number of strategies to do something, right? And what's interesting is there's very little in the research and very little in terms of promising practices that are actually available to us. One of the most notable programs in the country is at the University of Virginia, a program that was collaboratively developed both by the College of Education as well as the School of Business at UVA. But everybody, it's interesting because we've tried strategies of get rid of the principal, and then we discovered, well, that didn't work, so let's get rid of some of the staff, and sometimes that may work or may not. So again, it's a growing, developing field of inquiry, but I do believe that we can bring to you what we know and what we've learned across the U.S.
Well, I recognize the fact that good leadership practices are probably universal, but the fact that we are focused on the low-performing schools, I think maybe at some point we need to address, is there a different challenge level, or is it just tough by nature?
If we subscribe, and you know that I do, Senator Tippins, to the notion that leadership matters, yeah, sort of like that water you described earlier, right? The water's colder, perhaps, and it's maybe not as comfortable in some of these situations. But when you see the passion and you know that you've got inspired leadership, there are examples, there are great examples of where a leader with the right knowledge, the right talent, the right characteristics were able to turn around. And that is one of the things that I believe that they teach, and one of the things that they focus on at the University of Virginia's Turnaround School program.
Glenn, could I say something?
Yes, sir.
In response to your question, the Georgia Department of Education has some very interesting data about some school districts that on paper look like they should be very low performing, and yet given demographics and everything, they look like they should be part of that 155 schools. They're not. In fact, they're outperforming many of the schools in their area. So there are examples in this state where, like I said, you put all the pieces together, you think these schools wouldn't be performing as well as they are. And in talking to some of the colleagues in the Department of Education, it's clear that leadership is a critical factor in those schools. So it's back to the earlier point, there are some great examples in this state where this kind of leadership is happening.
And so, Senator Tippins, again, I think your SEAL example and your SEAL story was very relevant earlier. So how do we teach people that, and how do we know if they are teachable? How do we know if we're encountering a person who, given the choices that you described, say, no, I'm going to stay in the water? So there's a little bit of artistry involved. So one of the things that we often think about here is how we select. How do you pick them out? You know, how do you know? So I've got, 10 candidates, and they all got the same credentials. They all got a license, and they can all quote, from the research, but once in the water, what will they do? Will they adapt? Mr. Wilbanks often talks about adaptive challenges. The question is, do you swim or do you jump out of the water and run to the hot shower, right? So again, these are some things that I think you will be considering ultimately, Ms. Hampton, when we talk about some of the logistics and some of the operational stuff of, how this happens, how you go about making it happen.
Glenn, if I could, first of all, thank you. And for 25 years I've followed you. You probably remember a young kid that interned with you about 26 years ago. Commenting on Bob's and Lindsay's comments, the one thing I would suggest that we be very cautious about, because Alvin and I have been around long enough to know, I guess the Air Force called them fast burners, that there are individuals whose data looks awful good for a year or two or three, but much like what we learned from reading Good to Great, when you start talking about individuals who've not only turned schools around, or districts that have turned schools around, and then maintained that progress for 5 years, for 10 years, for 15, the list gets mighty short. And what we've seen in some of those that have had flash in the pan turnarounds is that there were not many practices involved that were worth replicating. So as we choose those districts, longevity should certainly be a key component of that. The question that I have for you, growing up north of Green Bay, I remember a Vince Lombardi comment 40, 50 years ago when they were bragging on him, saying, you must have an incredible amount of wisdom, coach. Gosh, the way your teams perform. And Lombardi said, you know what I've got? He said, I've got 2 tackles. He said, you give me 2 tackles and I'll look like I've got a lot of wisdom. You asked, was there research that we'd like to see that I see missing in what we've started with here? And I'm not sure it's out there, but it's one that I'm always fascinated by. And that is leaders born or made. And in terms of if we're going to put a substantial investment into developing leaders, it has appeared to us in 18 years of the superintendency that who we choose to put into those programs may be the most important component of the test and of the program. Can we look at some of the components? Can we look at how we go about, if we're going to make this investment, that it's not a pick me, but it's a very carefully crafted process of what individuals within our districts have the most potential lead these schools, the competencies don't change. But if we pick individuals that are just not wired for the job, as Lindsay was talking about, and then we can waste an awful lot of resources. Are we going to spend some time talking about pre-leader activities, who we put into these programs? And you all have done it as well as anyone in Gwinnett County. But that would just appear to be something that, in terms of what's in front of me right now, I'm not seeing much information, and I know you've got a wealth of experience in that area.
Mr. Wilbanks?
Glenn, I really think, Will, when you start talking about who do you select to be in these programs, if you're doing a generic leadership program, you can do that, and you should do that. I don't know, Glenn, I think we have 6 or 7 different assessments that the people that apply for our Leadership Academy go through in order to be selected. However, we have 155 schools out there that already has a principal, either a good one or one that's really challenged. So the birds on the windowsill, what do we do with those? And I think what we've got to do is really look at some things that really deal with the practices and the other things that goes on in that school. I personally don't think leaders are born. Now, there are people born with innate abilities that add to it. I think leaders are made. I think you have to study, you have to practice, you do a number of things. There may be those that develop leadership skills or already possessed them through their birth, perhaps, but I think in today's age and climate, it varies. There are so many adaptive challenges that you have to deal with. So I think there are some evidence of the RAND Corporation uses a lot of data when they evaluate the grants, the Wallace grants. And I think the Council of Great City Schools, they've done a lot of research on that as well. But I think there's no set answers to some of these things. For example, if you have a generic leadership academy, you've got control over who gets in. But if you're trying to take the districts that are already there with the schools that are already there, it's probably a different approach that you have to take with those. Unless you have the authority and the right to fire the people that are the principal there that are not performing. And then two, is it because of the principal, or is it because of other people, or is it a combination of things? And I think we know it's normally a combination of things, not just one person. So that's a tough issue you brought up.
It's a tough one, Alvin, but even in a generic leadership academy, if we can give 180 districts the information about certain types of individuals that tend to be much more successful in leadership, I would think that would be fundamental. You call it one thing. In my lifetime, I tend to call it, if you have someone who does not have a relatively high threshold for dealing with ambiguity in this day and age, I believe there are certain individuals that are born without a very high threshold of being able to deal with ambiguity. They are dead in the water when it comes to leading a school in the year 2017. And it would just seem to me that there are some foundational qualities people have to be successful leading schools in the times that we live in, and I would hope that we would look at some of those foundational skills so that districts would at least know.
You can look at on that.
Yeah. We do. You know, there's been quite a bit of work on the area of emotional intelligence, and all of us would agree that whether it's able to deal with ambiguity or adapt, move on your feet, that those kinds of behaviors or characteristics probably fall more into the area of emotional intelligence rather than intelligence quotient or IQ. And so over time, we very much believe some of the same things you're talking about, that we've got to assess. We've got to learn as much. We know what they know because we can test that, whether I give them a test on school law or school facilities, or whether they can quote the latest literature on instructional leadership. The more important question is, when faced without a clear answer or a clear direction, how do you handle that? And how do you respond to that? Or if the superintendent, I know you superintendents don't ever do this, but if a superintendent would say, you know, folks, we got to tighten our belt. Guess what? We're in difficult times, and I'm going to ask you perhaps to give up some things that you've grown accustomed to. So as a school leader, how do I react to that? So my behavior, whatever those things inside me, my emotional intelligence, these behaviors that I've honed over time will cause me to say, yes, I understand, I can adapt. We will take what we have and move with it. You need me to stay in that cold water a little bit longer? I can do it. I will do it because I want to do it. So these things, but these kinds of things take time, energy, and effort. And many times, Senator Tippins, we sometimes lose our resolve because when we say, in order for me to assess that, Mr. Schofield, I'm going to need 2 days. I need 16 hours of time to spend with a potential leader to put them through some simulations and to put them into some problem-based situations so that using tried and true methodology, I can assess how they react. Can they deal with ambiguity? Are they adaptable? Are they likely to be rewarded and satisfied with, as Colin says, keeping the flywheel moving? Or do I lose interest? You know, I started one little initiative and now, let's start another one. You know, I'm just that kind of person. I can't be happy for very long. You know, I got to change things all the time. And what I think we know, what the research is very clear, is that great organizations and great leaders are the ones who sustain known flywheels of improvement or progress. So there are ways to do that, and yes, sir, I will make sure that we bring some of that information to the entire committee. So there are tools. They take time. And sometimes, you know, we get a little too anxious. I don't have time to do that because I need to go ahead and fill the position. I'll learn about them later, whether they'll stay in the water or not. But we'll bring it to you. It's out there. Other questions or comments that you have?
I don't necessarily have a question. I want to say, being one of those that's boots on the ground as principal in a high school, I'm hearing a lot of great items that I think can go well together. I think we do need to look at the 155. I think we do need to look at who we are developing to be our next leaders for all schools, because I think the point that I know everybody in this room knows is there's an individual sitting in a classroom that we're all going back and looking at, and it's that kid that's the important person that we're trying to figure out how to lead that kid. And I think that that's the most important piece. And I think, Dr. Pethel, you got a great way of explaining things, and just being that person that's in that building trying to lead those teachers and lead those kids. I believe that there is an excellent way that we can come together and meet both of those items, and I think you can help us get there. So I just want to say that so much. Thank you, guys.
Mr. Wilbanks?
Anybody else have a question or a comment? You've had a lot of information, and much of the things that the thumb drive has all of the things on the Wallace things that you gave on this.
No, sir, it does not have everything on that bibliography. What it does have are the 5 documents that I've described today.
Good.
But again, if there's anything, as you look at that annotated bibliography, just let us know and we'll be more than happy. All of the publications from Wallace are free. They are all in public domain, so there's no copyright issues. And again, I know, and Mr. Wilbanks knows from the president of the Wallace Foundation, that nothing would make them more happy than for us to do great things with moving school leadership forward here in the state of Georgia.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bethel.
Yes, sir. Mr. Wilbanks, you want to talk about the assignments before I do the outreach?
No, we'll do that after
All
lunch.
right.
Okay, so far, what are your questions? What are your thoughts? How'd I get off of this committee? Can we meet more often?
I have a comment or question. I think I'll be interested in seeing as well is how the interaction with the community has played a significant role with principal leadership.
Okay.
And to build on several comments that have been made that have really struck me, what I'm really, I guess what's really rolling around in my head is the fact that we all know that professional learning, and I'm thinking of this academy as a form of professional learning for practicing principals. We all know that it's only as effective as the follow-up that goes along with it, and you mentioned that earlier, Chairman Wilbanks. And so I guess this is a question. It's also perhaps a suggestion that our final report should include some foundational elements and expectations of school systems and school boards, such that those who participate in this academy, when they go back home and their feet are on the ground, that they have opportunities to network, that they have opportunities to continue to learn, so that follow-up is almost like a support system for them when they're back home. I just feel like the research that Glenn has pointed us to, I think as we really dig into that, we're going to see the importance of those supports above the principal level. And Mr. Schofield, you made that point very well. The principal can't do it alone. And so I urge us to really attend to that, those foundational elements, those actions, whatever we want to call them, that have to happen on an ongoing basis to make this work, to make it successful.
Good point. Who else?
Mr. Wilbanks, not to make this more than we can possibly do, but thinking about particularly what Senator Tippins mentioned and what you've mentioned, the focus on the lower performing schools and some of the challenges that exist in some of those districts, I think we need to think of sort of a two-pronged approach if possible, working with the existing principal, but also working with those districts to help build a system to identify and start to develop a pipeline of additional leaders. In a lot of these places, they're not going to be recruiting people from far away to come in. And so developing the talent that is local, I think, is going to be a critical piece of the work. And the talent that is sitting in the chair right that moment may not work out, and it would be wise to help them have some alternatives, coming up the ladder. I think if we can figure out a way to incorporate that into the work.
Excellent point. Yep. Okay.
One of the things that I take away from a lot of the input is that this seems to be an age-old problem and from a lot of angles. And what I mean by that is there's no easy answer to this, and we keep coming at it from a lot of different angles. And I've heard a couple of individuals talk about it boils down to trying to find the right people that are resilient enough to go in and learn about something that's very different. And I'll speak from a principal's perspective. You're not going in and learning about a school, you're going in and learning about people that are in your school. You're learning about your community, as you brought up. You're learning about how that community interacts with that particular school, which may be very different from a school that's 10 minutes down the road. You're learning from people in your building, and you have to be able to support those individuals. And you know, some of them you keep supporting and supporting and supporting, and at some point you have to ask them the question, is that the right person for this job? But they're still your people. And I like the idea, Mr. Schofield, that you kind of came up about looking at the people that go into these programs. Are there some foundational pieces that they're able to be flexible and adaptive? But I also would challenge us to look at, are there pieces in place that we can learn from the past ghosts of the schools, of the principals that were in those schools before? Is there something we can learn from that worked or didn't work? Is there some type of a roadmap that is flexible and adaptable, not a recipe, but a little bit of a guideline that would give some support for a principal going into a school or a community to have a little bit of a head start on who to talk to, who to ask, and what it takes to be able to find the support necessary to stay in the water as long as necessary.
Good. Mr. Wilbanks, I'll make one comment. I think we may want to consider in this, clearly this will be recommendations for the development of the Leadership Academy, but I think someone may have alluded to the challenges of local districts, the small districts that may not even have the know-how of how to hire, how to do the pre-hiring process and the evaluation. I think it may help us to put in one piece of that as a recommendation to the state that not only do we have a leadership training academy, maybe we could develop some easily transportable guidelines for hiring, the tools that are available for analysis of the individuals that are being considered for particular jobs, or the specific skills that may be needed. And all of you have more knowledge in this area than I do about what's specifically needed. But I can brag on Gwinnett County. Alvin, you've done a great job, and I think that's attested to the fact that when you look at the low-performing schools, I don't think I've ever seen one of your schools on that list. But and I think that goes to the fact that y'all probably hire as well as anyone in the state. But I think the two-pronged approach is we have to have the academy per se, but I think we can also have some an appendix of helps that may go to the districts that help them to identify, because you alluded to the fact, and Martha Ann did too, we're probably going to be dealing with a lot of people already in a specific district, and it may be that the person sitting in that chair may not have been able to make the cut had they gone through the processes of evaluation. And that may lead a local district to realize we like this person and they've been here a long time, but it probably was not a good hire on their position. And I think the sense of urgency needs to be there, in that we're not willing to wait until that person retires to make a change in that position. And I've seen districts do that to the detriment of kids. I think if a change needs to be made, it needs to be made as quickly as you have a better replacement there, and let that person go back to the position, the last point in their career that they were truly successful, and maybe try to help them build in another pathway or whatever. But I think we can have a dual role for the training and the assistance to the districts. Okay.
If I may, Mr. Wilbanks, over here. I appreciate what you were saying, Mr. Matthews, about the reach out to the communities and find out exactly what they need. I also think that we really need to take a look at what is in the principal pipeline. I think it's going to be really important for us to have a lot of people sitting on ready to step into those leadership positions, as opposed to needing those leaders and not having them. So I think that that's going to be a really key component also. Again, based on what is going to be district priorities and district timelines, trying to help them find people and get them ready to go.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I probably should have asked Glenn this question, but the states that have the plan, are they primarily training existing principals, or is that a state plan to create a pool of principals that school systems across the state can recruit from or select from? We have, in Georgia, almost half of our school districts have less than 3,500 students. And I frequently get calls from some of those superintendents saying, we have some local talent, but some of the ones that we're selecting for principals really don't want to be a principal, but we don't really have a whole lot to select from, so we're encouraging them to take on the principal role, and we'll support them as much as we can. But even though they're willing to step into the water, it's somewhat with a push, Senator Tippins, because they do not have a large selection of people to select from, and they're asking us, or me, how can we get principal candidates to come to Terrell County to consider working here, and would they be trained? Would they have the wherewithal to take measure, as Jeff said, of what they're stepping into and respect the culture, respect the history, without being too much influenced by history, if that culture and that history has not been successful? So in the state plans, I guess what I'm asking that you work with, is that a recruitment pool, or is it more of the training of existing principals?
It's both and more. It's both and more. So the state plans that I'm familiar with and that we'll be bringing, again, firsthand information to you on, address what Ms. Cromer talked about with the pipeline. And in our work with smaller rural school districts, Gary, we've heard the very same thing, the same question. Where will the talent come from? And as we talk more, we discover that perhaps not as much attention has been given to developing leadership or developing the pipeline in places that they've never thought about. For example, rather than waiting until the event of a vacancy occurs, we should be about the business of developing parapros to become teachers, teachers to become assistant principals to become principals. And in some respects, I see it as a mindset about where do you see the talent. Do I wait until I try to beg, borrow, or steal from one of my neighbors? We say, look, if you believe that you've done a good job and you have good teachers, and particularly in these small, sparsely populated, you have teachers who want to be there. They grew up there, they come home, they stay home. So have you ever given thought to developing them and causing them to open their eyes? And don't wait until the event of the vacancy occurs that you know and you're tracking these great grade level managers, these great department chairs along the way. And it is a different way of thinking, Gary. So, but again, I hope and we plan to learn more from some of these other state models, because again, that's an issue that's not unique to Georgia. So, you know, Kentucky, a lot of rural areas in Kentucky, a lot of rural areas in Missouri. So how they are getting people to think differently about where that leadership, and you don't wait You don't cross your fingers and hope that somebody just finished a program. So part of the formula, I believe, or one of the effective strategies, is making sure that we forecast for the future. In other words, we're really thinking about, with all respect, Scott, when you might be retiring, when it's possible for you to retire. And we're thinking 10 years out or 15 years out, and we're planning for that, and we're tracking that along the way. And again, this is not necessarily difficult to do. It's not necessarily rocket science. There are strategies, there are tools for doing that and doing it very effectively. I apologize for the length of my response, Gary.
Well, it is, as Mr. Wilbank said earlier, Georgia has the third largest number of rural students in the United States, and yet we really don't hear I don't think we hear enough discussion around the state about that fact, and that we have so many small school districts, and they are struggling. They are really struggling in every aspect of providing services to students that they deserve. They're struggling in all aspects of that.
Our experience, Gary, has been that, we all want the same thing, regardless of where we live, the size of the community. We want the best, and most of us, it's real easy for us to see the future through our kids. So again, in some respects, it's opening our eyes, perhaps changing our mindset, and rather than thinking I'm isolated and no one knows, the issues we have, that we move toward others do recognize, and there are strategies, and perhaps there are things that we can do. Again, some interesting learnings for us from our work down in Southwest Georgia, that great superintendents, great principals, strong desire to be better, strong desire. But again, it's like, so what resources are available? And the more we can expose them and say there are resources, that there are those, as Senator Tippins, I think you said, there are some of those transportable tools. There are some of those things that, these are just good practices regardless of who you are or where you work. So the more we share and the more resources we make, I think it'll help those smaller school districts.
Okay. Anybody else have a comment?
My only main point is that this academy could be a lifesaver for the rural school system. I mean, obviously for all others as well, but this could be that training lifeline and that leadership development lifeline that they desperately need now and in the future. Otherwise, we're going to see continuous decline. And
I think a couple of things that surfaced, I'll try to sum up this first session today. It's real easy for committees like this to start branching out, and we want to save the world. And it would be good if we could. And there are a lot of things that we really want to do. As a matter of fact, if you could design an ideal academy, you'd probably want to have a generic leadership program for a principal pipeline, preparing people who want to be principal. Probably preceded by that, you'd probably want to have one that prepares assistant principals. For years, this is our recruitment process with assistant principals. You walk down the hallway and you look in a classroom and say, gosh, Joe's been doing a good job for a long time and we need an assistant principal. So you go in, hey, Joe, you ever thought about being an assistant principal? Well, no, not really. Well, or maybe, yes, I have. Well, look, we need one. In the morning, you find yourself up the hallway in an office. No preparation whatsoever. So all of those are real needs for us, but I think what we've got to do is really look at what can we put some priorities on a real, what I would term a real successful global type academy, okay? One is a generic model that will allow us to prepare principals, people to be principals. At the same time, and probably simultaneously, the priority is to really, how are we going to provide some assistance to the principals that are already in those schools that are identified as low-performing schools? So what are we going to do with them? And then later on, we may want to look at a assistant principal program. Later on, we may want to look at a district leader program, because I contend that the principal supervisor, we found this out with Wallace, probably the most, the job that was the most ambiguous was a principal supervisor. And then the district leader office. So they're all facets of a good leadership academy, but I think our remind us of our charge, our purpose is a strategic, generic leadership academy to prepare principals to be effective leaders in the school. And then looking at those, what that number is, Gary, how are we going to help them? And I think your word, now all of them aren't in South Georgia. We have a number of them here in the metropolitan area. Actually, I think that'll be an easier fix than the ones in South Georgia, as you so eloquently expressed. But that's probably our priority beginning this July. Okay? With that, let's have lunch. If you don't like anything on the tray, there is a cafeteria downstairs that you can go to. It has a very broad selection, but hopefully you'll be able to enjoy what's out there on the plate for you. Help yourself. Let's come back at 12:40, okay? That'll give us 30 minutes. What's that?
We've been getting told we got done at 2 today, and you said 3. Which is it?
It's 2. I just want you to think 3, and then you'll be happy that you're going to get out.
Hey, Will, and he's gonna take all the credit for getting this out an hour early.
You're gonna say I cut all the crap out of it and got you guys out of it?